There's a clown exercise where a basic exercise where the clown student stands on the stage in front of the audience and has to do nothing and just look at them in the eyes, one, not normally with this bigger group. And it's really difficult. It's really difficult to do nothing. And the teacher sits with the audience and looks at the student and talks about what they see, basically what they have in their gift, what they already are before they layer any kind of mask on, before they put the red nose on, what they look like physically, whether they seem nervous, the nature of the silence, perhaps the sounds that are coming from the room next door, the light, the way they're squinting with the sunlight coming in through the window, all of these sorts of things. And this is an exercise, obviously, to teach the performer about how little they need to do to be interesting and to be funny, and where that is actually the basis of everything. But I also really saw it as an exercise in what the audience is picking up on before anything begins at all. How much is happening in the room, how much noise there is. I don't mean just physical noise, I mean it's such a complex space. This is a particularly complex space. There's lots of ways out, there's sounds coming from there. All of these things are part of the experience of the audience before anything else happens. I start with space. I'm a performer, but I start with space. And with SHUNT, we really start with space. And we basically do a version of this exercise in the building or as a part of the audience's journey. We stand outside on the street and we're like, oh, there's the building, that's our building, we've got that building. Maybe we do it before we get the building to see if we want to get the building, but say we've got it, we've chosen our space, and say it's a building. And we'll stand outside, sorry. Ooh, yes, can you hear me now? This is nice. I feel even more like a performer like this. Okay, can you all hear me now? Even at the back? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so that thing about the clown exercise was looking. This teacher also used to do it in the old Vic, and she said, what you're looking for is you're looking for your friends. So you find somebody in the front row, and you find somebody over there, and you find somebody in the balcony up right at the top. I'm talking about this because even though that's a totally theatrical situation, it's about how the space is framed by the performance and how present the audience feels within it. So we're talking about looking at the space from the outside. Stand, look at the building. It's big, it's small. What do I expect from it? So, for example, we had a building that was quite a big 80s warehouse. It looked pretty nondescript, really. But then once you got inside, it was just one room. There were no floors, so it wasn't a particularly big building from the outside, but inside it was surprising simply because it was bigger than we'd expected. Sometimes there's a massive gift in the space of how you enter into the space. We also had an incredible entrance in the middle of London Bridge Station that you went in and suddenly it was this 60-metre corridor of Victorian railway arches right in the middle of the station. So we look at what the gift of the space is in the same way that I'm talking about the gift that the performer has before they do anything, before you put anything on it. And we also talk about what is going to be exciting in that space, what we want to see. Another example of this is when we made a show in Trafalgar Square, which was using headphones, and we just sat in the square and basically looked at the square for a lot of the time. This is the performers as well, I hasten to add. This isn't just the designers. This is the company. And we look and we go, oh, there are planes going overhead. So then that becomes a part of it is that you have
the sound of a plane as though you're zooming into, which is, of course, a real plane. So we look at the space and we see what the real gifts of the space are. And then once we're in the rehearsal process, this becomes more complex. So we sort of walk the audience's experience again. I'm walking in through the door. There's a man there. Is he a performer? Can I go up to him? Will he touch me? Oh, he's not wearing any trousers. How do I feel about that? So we try and see, as much as we are creating a fiction and telling a story, we keep coming back to this real audience, experience. So I'm going to talk mainly today about that real experience and the fictional experience and the double experience that the audience is having of the space, of the show, of the performance. Design is all together for me, so it's not just about the space. For a little context on my work, I began working in experiential theatre, shall we say, in 1998 with SHUNT. We are a collective of 10 artists, and we shared the rent on the railway arch as a space to make work. Immersive wasn't a term that I was aware of then. I first heard it applied to a show that we did in 2002, but I don't know the initials, where it was used initially. But we weren't starting with that term in mind. That came later. We called it the live event. We wanted to be an alternative to the sofa, and we wanted the audience to feel alive, and we wanted to be able to say to our friends, yeah, it's really worth spending that money to come out and be in this room with these people. We called it an event, a SHUNT event, because we wanted people to approach it in a way that they might approach a gig or a night out, an indulgence. And the bar was always a really crucial part of that. The bar was within the performance space itself. I mean, we only had one room, so we had the bar, and then we had the show, and then we had the bar. And it was a really important thing for us that we didn't want the audience to be shoved out and then go elsewhere. We actually wanted the audience to share the experience and the performers to be in the same space as the audience, all sharing that together. We later made a whole project, which was the SHUNT Lounge. That was a club with curated work as part of a night out, and that ran for 4 years, between 2006 and 2010. And it made the name of the company basically associated with the space. You would go to SHUNT as much as you would go to see SHUNT. I'm not going to talk so much about the SHUNT Lounge. I'm very happy to talk about it afterwards, but it's not exactly it's not the sort of core of the immersive, where the term immersive came from for us. And then we wanted the audience to feel the show viscerally. We wanted the room to be the most exciting room in London. I'm going to play you a little video, which shows one of our very early first shows, just to give you a bit of a feeling of the tone of the company. Is it loud enough, right? Yeah.
Everyone's going to have to work together a little bit, which might involve crouching or squatting, whatever you prefer.
One drink is only £2 on top.
Please turn off mobile phones. There is a strobe light used in the show.
No smoking.
No smoking. Please, could the women follow Lizzie through that exit? And the men come over here.
well, deal with whatever happens in the space. I should listen to my own, my own lecture. So I start with the space. What is it? And what it is and what it feels like. It felt very important to us as we forged our first show that if people were coming to what was then a pretty obscure, dark bit of London, down a damp alleyway into a grubby arch, that it would still be the perfect venue. I don't want to create a show that feels like it's aspiring to be somewhere else or it's aiming to be something else, or if we had more money, we'd be doing this, or any of these things. It needs to be, to feel live and to feel immersive and to feel that it matters, it needs to be exactly the right performer in exactly the right room at exactly the right time, whatever that is. So it's no sort of mistake that we chose a story about a group of people who tried to make something out of nothing. We took as our source for that show Alive, which is the real story of a plane crash in the Andes where a team of Uruguayan rugby players were stranded for a few horrifying weeks and ended up eating each other to survive. So the story was a sort of extreme, terrible fictionalization of how we felt about the space and how we felt about what we could do in the space and probably about each other as well, to a certain extent. The audience walked into a plane that was made of paper and string. There was a stewardess, perfectly dressed, with a SHUNT Air label. And we had SHUNT peanuts and we had little toothbrushes. So we had all of that stuff, but the plane was paper and string. We used complete blackout. That's really cheap, but you need it to be really, really good. And we used extreme sound of extreme plane crash. And when the lights came back on, the plane had disappeared and the space beyond was revealed. We talk about revelation of space quite a lot. The audience were passengers, and that was given to them by the way that the stewardess within the space was relating to them. Sorry, excuse me. And then they were dead after that. For us, yeah, it was quite limited. We hadn't got that very far. It was our first show. So for us at the time, financial limitations were simply a reality. So it felt right to tell a story about making life from very little and making our plane from paper and string. These people were going to eat each other. If you have nothing, you can make something, but you're choosing a story that echoes the reality, even though it's an epic example of that. We're the Andes. It's like a little tiny archway. It's the Andes. But in some way, there's something about the way it feels. And the audience expectation, though, of the company changes with time, and the experience of the show also changes. At the time of the plane crash show, SHUNT was an unknown collective operating from a back alley in Bethnal Green. All of this kind of stuff was like, what's going on there? So, but by 2004, we were making work with the National Theatre. We made the first immersive show that they had as part of their venue. Well, not in their venue, in our venue. There was an off-site production. That was Tropicana. By that time, we had a vast 70,000 square foot railway arches in London Bridge. And the audience was changing and their expectation was changing, and the idea of immersive theatre was beginning to feel established, if not the establishment. So paper and string wasn't a thing. It wasn't an aesthetic that we were just going to continue with. The aesthetic changed with our next show. No, not our next show, a few later. So in 2008, we made a show based on a big Victorian novel about a company that grew exponentially and then collapsed into bankruptcy. So in some way, we were actually looking for a story that almost echoed where we might be. And so for this story of economic collapse, we built this building in the building that I was talking about. So that's the set. And a part of the real audience experience was, you built that thing, that's crazy, that must have cost a lot of money, etc. It felt heavy. It was supposed to feel like a big chunk of money, basically. The lightness or the weight of the aesthetic of our first show gave it a feeling of vulnerability. There's a plane there, but the plane can go like that. And this set, on the other hand, was meant to feel, as it was, that it would take a hell of a lot to get it out of the building. And I suppose it was meant to feel like the weight of history, in a way. I tried to keep present with the moment of where the audience are, what their expectation is, and where we are, and what they're expecting of us. I think of all of my work as set in the modern world, because I'm interested in blurring the boundaries between fiction and reality. And the reality is modern. So I've made shows using the real city as my scenography. And of course, the audience, anyway, is in the modern world. So the question then is, within a show like this, so they go in here, they go up into the building, it has glass floors, they can see through, etc., etc. Stuff happens in there. But the question is, are they visible within the fiction? In some immersive theatre, the space is shared, but the audience is not sharing the space. That's going to be really annoying, isn't it? There we are. The space is shared, but the audience isn't sharing the space with the show. Can we do something about that? Thank you. Sorry. So that's mostly true in something like Punch Drunk. The audience wears the fourth wall like a sort of second skin, and I'm going to pull that out, and moves through invisibly, mostly. They're invisible within the space. Sometimes they become visible, but mostly they're not there. But in a shunt show, they absolutely are. They're present, they're visible. They might be being ignored by the performers, but that's because they're being ignored, or maybe the character just hasn't noticed them, or maybe they have noticed them, but they're busy doing something else. So the situation in here could easily be the beginning of a shunt show, a part of a shunt show. Say I'm the performer and you're the audience, but the picture doesn't make sense until you're here. And that's always the case in shunt. The scenography doesn't make sense without the audience. It's not something which is a picture and then the audience sort of move through it. As though invisible, as though through a film, the audience is the picture. So we've done things where we're sitting in rows opposite each other within something that echoes the British Parliament, and the performers are sitting with the audience. I'm sitting next to people, and I'll talk to them about what's happening opposite. People will stand and speak and engage each other in debate, but the picture doesn't make any sense until those seats are filled by the audience coming into the picture. So what do they look like? Obviously, contemporary. The audience is wearing their clothes. They're wearing the kind of thing you're wearing right now. And this is one reason why our fiction must, in some sense, be modern. It's sort of the opposite of a secret cinema approach, or a sort of a role play approach, where the audience dresses up to integrate with the aesthetic of the show. The shunt aesthetic has to integrate with the audience as they are. Even when we built the Victorian monstrosity of a set for a Victorian novel, for an adaptation of a Victorian novel, we then imagine that as an artifact within the modern world. So in the case of that space, The 80s warehouse around the machine was absolutely visible. And there was bunting sort of attaching to the warehouse itself. And it was almost treated as another version of the Eiffel Tower or something, which was built around the time that the novel was written and was intended to be temporary, if you can believe it, and then ended up lasting and becoming something which is Victorian but is also absolutely integrated into the modern aesthetic of Paris. And so we sort of do that in a way. We take things from the past and we integrate them. In this case, we build something which looks Victorian, but that all of the performers are in modern dress, and the fiction of it is something about, here is this space that is a relic of empire, maybe, and a relic of the weight of history. It was interesting fact with that machine that actually I met an engineer a few years later who asked me how old it was. A few people thought that we'd found it. That happens to us quite a lot. We design things, even something insane. I mean, it's like a Victorian steam machine in the middle of an 80s warehouse with glass ceiling and floors that the audience can walk in and see through. And they thought we'd found it. So it's sort of gutting in a way, but it's also brilliant. So I take history and I put it into the present because I'm trying to create mythologies of the modern world. So I haven't got anything here, that's all right. So Money was a Victorian novel. Dance Bear Dance was based on the gunpowder plot of 1605, which is a failed attempt to blow up English Parliament. Does anybody know about that? Yes, and we started working that for August 2001. So a month later, the show changed, and the aesthetic of modern terrorism became absolutely what we were dealing with. And our little railway arch became something that we brought people into it as into a railway arch, and we thought there are trains travelling overhead, and we were like, you could actually do that. You could totally stuff this with gunpowder and blow up a train. Maybe that's what will happen in England, because it will be some sort of bungled version of what happened in America. And that is sort of what happened. Somebody tried to blow up London Transport, and it wasn't entirely successful. So we have this modern aesthetic, but we use things from the past as well within it. And that goes for the language as well. We talked about gunpowder in the show, although absolutely the aesthetic was that we were in the modern world. The architects took the myth of the Minotaur in 2012 for a show about the collapse of European civilization, and Kingdom Come last year was about English Civil War. So the fiction takes a step towards the reality of the audience. Who is the audience within this world? They aren't players as such in our world. It's a more theatrical approach. The role I'm looking for the audience is one that reframes their presence and their actions and their behaviour as an audience. So I'm not requiring them to enter into a play of something else, but just to enhance what they are already doing. And that means also that the role has to chime with the realities they've paid. They don't know what's happening. The performer knows the space better than them. But they are part of the picture with the performers. So it's really about how the performer plays with them that teaches them who they are in the space and in the set. Knowing exactly what their role is at any one time is really important, and knowing what status they have within the space is also something really fun to play with. status between the performer and the audience, or in fact, any things that you deal with between performer and audience in a acting sort of situation can be applied as questions to the real audience. Whatever the role is that we want the audience to be, I always enjoy, as a performer, thinking of it as a kind of grand misunderstanding on my part as a performer. The door opens and I look up and I say, oh, I assume you must be here for the whatever. And they go along with it. So the performers often play functionaries of the space, waiters, ushers, a lift operator, etc. Or in a higher status, I played the engineer of the machine and the architect of a ship. We often have a relationship with the space as characters. And just aesthetically, that means that the performers, they're playing people who in real life often have a kind of costume or a uniform. So I'm wearing a waiter's outfit, as are all the other performers, but I'm in the same reality as you, because in a real world I would be doing that. And you can choose something then that sort of integrates with the reality of the audience and enhances the set and uses the performer as a sort of aesthetic conduit between the space and the audience in the space. Sometimes we wear things that really make us look exactly like the audience, or as though we could be a part of the audience, but quite often we take on these functions. In Dance Bear Dance 2002, that was our terrorism show, the audience came down the little dark alleyway in the East End, and two dog mask figures knocked on the door to the arch. I opened it, wearing a dog mask. I let them in. I shut the door. They gave me some cash. I gave them a badge with the name of the country and a flag. I'm wearing one too. They have a drink. When the bell goes, I sit at the head of the table, which is in the middle of the room. There's one thing that has been built, and Lizzie is really good at sort of putting everything into one piece of strong set. So even when we didn't have a lot of money, there'd be one really strong choice. So we had this beautifully built table with a bench around it in the middle of the room. And it's like a UN conference, sort of play on a UN conference. There are the names of the countries around. So by this stage, the audience have their ticket, which has a name of a country. I'm wearing a suit, but I basically could be one of them. I have the name of my country. And when the bell goes, I take my seat and they take their seats. So they've come in the door to the theatre. They've bought a ticket and they've sat down. That's all they've done. But now they're in it, and with having done nothing, really, having played nothing, they have made themselves complicit within the aesthetic and within the story. And then we play with how much we are in the same place as them. So they're sitting attentive by this stage, and the fiction is, we're friends. I say, welcome, thank you for coming, friends. They don't have to play my friends. I'm using friends in a sort of political sense. People call each other friends without necessarily being friends. And I have their country names, so I can say thank you, Kazakhstan, for the gunpowder, and thank you, Cuba, for the amusing additions to page 5. That was very funny. And I laugh, or maybe they laugh and I laugh with them, or they laugh and I don't know why. So within my fiction as a character, what they're doing as an audience, laughter is a really good example, is something that I can be like, yeah, that makes sense in my world, or can be something which I'm like, that makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. And you can actually start to, which we did in this show, start to push that until we no longer trust them and we're not their friends anymore and we try to blow them up. So, and fail. So the clash is interesting, and the question of trust between the performer and the audience is interesting there. The space comes first, and then the material, say the gunpowder plot, and then the situation with the audience. We often choose spaces which are public then. So I will look in the story, when we were looking at Money, the Victorian novel, I'm looking for the public spaces that are interesting to me, not just the parties. I mean, that's, of course, that's there. But the waiting room, the place outside of the room of power, that's a kind of interesting place in the novel that keeps getting returned to. It's somewhere where a group of strangers might be sitting, doing nothing, and that then is something that can be reframed back into the story. So we've had a swingers party, and the conference in Dance by Dance, and we rarely use domestic spaces then. We did this show that began in the penthouse with the swingers party. And so it's starting in this very clean, aesthetic, modern space. And 40 of the people, it was an audience of 100, 40 of the people were given a note telling them to leave when they heard the word swallow in the microphone. So 20 minutes into the party, half of the audience just walked out through the door in the corner. Everybody else doesn't quite know why. So that was one way of splitting the audience. Then we further split those groups into men and women. And the men found themselves in a sort of grubby bedsit with Simon trying to get a rather awkward party going, handing out a few beers, and they're all crammed in. And they're listening to the group of women who are in the room next door who are having a great time and laughing. And there are people fucking upstairs, which is actually a Foley scene, which you see later. And we're playing with the experience there in the immersive show experience of the audience wondering if somebody else is having a better time in one of the other spaces. So that's the sort of thing we talk about. We go, what do they really feel like? Because they're involved in this thing, and then there's this little bit, certainly for some people. Some people won't be thinking this, but some people will be thinking, maybe I'd have been better to go the other way, or maybe I wish they hadn't taken me, or whatever. So we are taking that and making a fiction out of it. So they're in this domestic space. What are they doing there? Simon's invited them back. He doesn't really know them, and he's trying to get this party going. Then Hannah returns home, and now there's a tension between Simon and Hannah and the situation. So she does the washing up in silence, and then after a small exchange, she says, "I think your friends should leave now." Simon opens the door, apologetically shuffles them out, and they find their way to a cinema seating, looking back on the window, which has the curtain across the window of the set. There's the Pearl and Dean music. They're looking at this set. The curtain opens, and Hannah now believes she's alone and undresses. So they're an audience again. But an audience of all men in a fictional cinema watching a real woman take off her clothes. And I wasn't actually part of making that at all, so I could just say I think that was really beautiful. I think there's something about the wrapping around of the cinema, the real, the experience of reality, and her sense of being alone and what it is to be an audience and to be in the space with her, and then to be allowed to just watch her. And there's still something immersive about the fact you're looking through the window. It's not on the stage. I want to finish with talking about the threshold into the show, the moment that the audience gets into the water, into the space of the show. And that can be putting headphones on in the middle of the street. And I'll use an example of how the real world and the space met each other in Tropicana. The vaults had this real gift of an entrance. It was in the middle of the station. Literally, there's the London Underground, London Bridge sign. Literally, steps away from that, there's a door in the middle of the station. And behind that, this space that everybody who's been there, whatever they thought of the show, or then the club that we ran there, would just be like, what, how is that? So that was something we were like, well, you can't not use that. We don't have to do anything. In fact, maybe we should do nothing. Maybe we should just let them in and say, look, that's maybe enough. So we were having an audience of 200, and we wanted them to experience this space. We wanted to control the entrance into the space. And Lizzie did this. Lizzie's the designer, did this in a masterful way, I think. So there's... we often talk about the moment of revelation of space and how to make the most of the moment. We built 3 initial spaces, smaller, contained spaces. David was really obsessed with the idea of a lift, as this was a way to control a group into, say, 25 people, and then control as the doors go back. It's almost like a proscenium arch with the curtains. It's sort of, there it is, and then there's the space beyond. So we knew we wanted to get the audience also with 25 people. If you're standing, everyone can see. We don't want people to be like, what's over there? And we also don't want to just open the door and let them in. So the lift, it seems almost perverse to make a show and build a lift when there are loads of buildings with lifts in them. But so we built this fake lift that, again, people thought was real because we just put a bit of movement into it and the sound. And then before that, there was a bar which held up to 200 people. I did have photos of these things, but it's all right. You can have a look on the website. We were looking here at real contrast. So the space, we did practically nothing to the space itself other than clean it, clear it. And we made the bar really plush and sort of exquisite and perfect so that we could create the sense of shift from the institute. And this institute had the performers within it in white lab coats, and then afterwards they met us again, all sort of fucked. So the lift is seen as this moment of transition between this reality and that reality. But before that, there was a door. So the door from the station itself, we built a little tiny room. That was the room you might actually think was on the other side of that door in the station. A little tiny room with rat poison and a railwayman sitting, modern railwayman sitting in the corner, ignoring you. And when you came in, there was no apparent way out of that room. So we then would have a small group of 8 come into there. Then the door would close, so that would be a protected space. And then they would go through the locker into the... first of all, they didn't know which way out, and eventually they were helped, or maybe they found it. And then they're in the institute, and then they're in the lift. So what I'm talking about there is the way that you choose the moments of revelation of the space itself. Look at what we're starting with, and look at where we're getting to, and making the first thing actually something that people thought, again, was real. Actually, somebody, I don't know how they did it, got to the other side of the lift and told one of the performers that they were looking for platform 5. So I don't know how they got through, but nevertheless, there was some sense of not knowing where it was beginning and where it was ending. I've been speaking about maintaining two simultaneous threads, reality and fiction, and they're the same when I apply them to work in existing real public spaces, where the gift of the space becomes a sunset or a city skyline, and where the characters are existing within the audience's world. I was in a show a long time ago in people's homes that exemplified this. It was really their space, and with very minimal design, we would just come in and perform it. And it mythologized that home, and it made the banal things that they were experiencing seem tinged with magic. So when Prospero has sat in front of your electric fire, there's an element to which the whole house will always be his to some extent. So with some little way, if you can reframe the reality, and then that continues to exist. And that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in keeping the live, the real, and the fictional within the space and within the performance always there. So people will come back to Tropicana and to the Tropicana space and go, isn't it in the basement? Because they'd been in the lift. And there's a sort of strange part of them that always felt like it was underground, even though they knew it wasn't. And for me, that is actually really the most exciting thing about any kind of performance, is that sense of, I know there are edges to this. I know it's not real, but I don't know quite where that boundary is. So that's that. And you can take these things and really make them part of the meaning of the show. Thank you very much. I'll be in the bar.